The night was cold, smelling of spring and gunpowder. April 19th, 1775. Dawn's rumor on the horizon. 77 Lexington farmers, cobblers, blacksmiths, stood ragged on the green, muskets ready. 700 elite redcoats marched, with orders to crush them. A decade of fury built this keg. Stamp Act taxes without vote, Townsend duties, Boston massacre, 5 dead in the snow. Tea Party defiance, intolerable acts choked Boston. Minutemen drilled, stockpiled, waited. No more taxation without representation. Paul Revere's midnight ride sparked the alarm. The regulars are out. Bells tolled, countryside woke. British crossed by boat, too late. At dawn, Parker commanded, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon." A shot cracked. Who fired first? War exploded. 8 dead on the green. Concord's bridge fell to Minutemen fire. 16-mile retreat. Ambushes from walls, woods. 73 Brits killed. 174 wounded. Farmers bloodied an empire, birthing revolutions worldwide. The world changed on that green. Honor their stand. Visit Lexington and Concord. Share this story. Fight for freedom today. Subscribe for more history that ignites. The night was cold, and it smelled of spring and gunpowder. Across the farms and sleeping towns of eastern Massachusetts, on the moonlit morning of April 19th, 1775, a wind moved through the apple orchards that had not yet leafed, through the bare woodlots and the wet pastures where cattle stood motionless as statues in the dark. In the village of Lexington, a church bell tolled the hours, and each note fell into a silence so complete that men standing on the common could hear their own breathing and the distant creak of cartwheels on a dirt road. It was not yet 5 in the morning. Dawn was still a rumor at the edge of the horizon. On that common, a triangular patch of trampled grass at the heart of an unremarkable New England town, 77 men stood in ragged formation, their muskets balanced against their shoulders, their boots sinking into ground softened by April rain. They were farmers and cobblers, a blacksmith, a tavern keeper, a school teacher. They were the Lexington militia, and they had been awake through the entire night, roused by riders bearing urgent news from the dark roads south of town. Somewhere behind them, out on the Bay Road, 700 of the finest soldiers in the British Empire were marching toward them with fixed bayonets and loaded muskets, and orders that would change the world. 700 against 77. An empire against a village. A professional army trained on the battlefields of Europe and the plains of India against men who had never fought a war, and some of whom were still pulling on their coats when they took their places in line. The numbers were so lopsided that the word battle feels too generous. The word ambush feels too dramatic. What happened on Lexington Green in the gray light of that April morning was something rarer and more dangerous than either. It was a confrontation between 2 ideas of the world each held so deeply that the men who carried them were willing to die before surrendering the ground beneath their feet. This morning changed everything. Not just for Massachusetts, not just for the 13 colonies stretching down the Atlantic coast. What began on Lexington Green was the first gunshot in a revolution that would eventually redesign the map of political power across the entire Western world, inspiring uprisings from Paris to Caracas, embedding a new vocabulary of rights and self-determination into the conversation of nations. The British soldier who fired first, we do not know his name, we do not know if he meant to, did not know what he was starting. Neither did the militiamen who fell. Neither did the 75 still standing. But the age of European empire was never quite the same afterward, and the age of democratic revolutions had just, trembling and uncertain, begun. The decade that built a keg of powder. To understand why 77 men with hunting muskets were willing to stand against a column of 700 redcoats, you have to understand what the previous 10 years felt like from inside a Massachusetts farmhouse. The year 1765 began what colonists would remember as a decade of accumulating grievances, each one small enough in isolation to seem like a misunderstanding rather than a policy, but which together added up to something that felt like deliberate strangulation. The Stamp Act of that year placed a tax on every piece of paper used in the colonies, every legal document, every newspaper, every pamphlet, even playing cards, and required that it be printed on paper stamped in London and sold only by royal agents. It was not a large tax, but it struck at the heart of colonial commerce and communication, and it had been imposed without a single colonial representative having a vote in its passage. In Boston, protests erupted immediately. The stamp distributor was hanged in effigy. His house was ransacked. He resigned before the act ever took effect. The British Parliament was bewildered. They had just finished the 7 Years' War, which had doubled Britain's national debt, and had been fought, at least in part, to defend the American colonies from French expansion. It seemed reasonable to men sitting in Westminster that the colonies should contribute to the cost of their own defense. It seemed to men living in Boston and Philadelphia and Charleston like a fundamental violation of the English principle that a man could not be taxed without his consent and the consent of his elected representatives. No taxation without representation was not a slogan invented for convenience. It was a principle with roots in Magna Carta, in the English Civil War, in the Glorious Revolution. The colonists believed they were Englishmen, and they believed Englishmen had rights that could not be stripped away by a parliament 3,000 miles away, in which they had no voice. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but almost immediately passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's absolute right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Then came the Townshend Acts in 1767, taxing glass, paper, paint, and tea imported into the colonies, and creating new customs enforcement mechanisms that felt, to many colonists, like occupation rather than administration. British customs commissioners arrived in Boston under naval escort. The sloop Liberty, owned by the merchant and patriot John Hancock, was seized on suspicion of smuggling. Riots broke out on the Boston waterfront. By 1768, the British government had concluded that Boston was ungovernable. 2 regiments of regular troops were dispatched to the city. 4,000 soldiers, roughly 1 for every 5 civilians, were quartered in Boston, occupying the Common, sleeping in public buildings, marching through the streets with drums and fifes. The colonists had to look at the soldiers every morning and remember that they had not asked for them, had not voted for them, and could not make them leave. Tensions accumulated like snow on a roof. On the evening of March 5, 1770, the roof gave way. A crowd of Boston men and boys had gathered around a small guard post near the custom house, throwing snowballs and insults at a lone British sentry. When reinforcements arrived under Captain Thomas Preston, the crowd surged closer, hurling ice and oyster shells. Someone threw a club. A soldier fell. And then, without a clear order, the soldiers fired into the crowd. 5 colonists died. The youngest was 17 years old, an apprentice walking home from work. The event was immediately named the Boston Massacre, and Paul Revere engraved an image depicting the soldiers firing in perfect, disciplined order at an unarmed crowd. It was propaganda, not journalism, but it captured what colonists already believed. Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties in 1770, keeping only the tax on tea as a symbol of their right to tax. The colonies settled into an uneasy truce. Trade resumed. Tempers, if not fully cooled, were at least banked. For 2 years the crisis seemed to ease, but the underlying disagreement had not been resolved. It had only been postponed. Then came December 16, 1773, and the night that made everything worse. A group of colonists, many of them Sons of Liberty members, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor carrying East India Company tea and threw 342 chests of it into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not a spontaneous outburst. It was planned and executed with considerable discipline, and it sent a message impossible to misread. The colonists were willing to destroy private property, to defy the law openly and publicly, rather than accept Parliament's authority to tax them without representation. Britain's response was the Coercive Acts of 1774, called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act restructured the colonial government to give the royal governor, General Thomas Gage, nearly absolute power, eliminating the elected council and restricting town meetings. The Quartering Act required colonists to provide housing for British troops. These acts were meant to isolate Massachusetts, to make the colony an example, to break the back of colonial resistance before it could spread. Instead, they unified the colonies. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia that fall, with delegates from every colony except Georgia, and agreed to economic sanctions against Britain and mutual support against British military action. By the spring of 1775, Massachusetts was not merely restless, it was organized. In towns and villages across the colony, militia companies had been reorganizing under the oversight of the Provincial Congress, which had effectively supplanted royal authority in everything but name. Towns were stockpiling arms and ammunition. a special category of militia, men who pledged to be ready to march at a minute's notice, had been formalized throughout the countryside. They called themselves Minutemen, and while the name had a theatrical quality, the men behind it were entirely serious. They were drilling on commons and in fields. They were preparing for something they did not want, but had decided they would not run from. General Thomas Gage, commanding British forces in Boston from his headquarters on Province Street, was not blind to this. He had spent enough time in Massachusetts to understand that the colonists were not bluffing. He had written to London that if the government intended to enforce its authority, it would require an army far larger than the 5,000 men at his disposal, and it would require them quickly. London's response had been impatience and contempt. Gage was told to act, to arrest the principal rebel leaders, to seize whatever military stores the colonists had accumulated, and to demonstrate that British authority in Massachusetts was not a suggestion. The target was Concord, 18 miles west of Boston, along a road that wound through Lexington and across the bridge over the Concord River. In Concord, the Provincial Congress had been storing cannon, ammunition, musket balls, salt pork, flour, and medical supplies intended for a colonial army that did not yet officially exist. If Gage could seize or destroy those stores, he could cripple colonial military preparations before they reached a point of no return. If he moved quickly enough and quietly enough, he might also arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the two most prominent Patriot leaders who had been staying in Lexington. Cut off the head, and perhaps the body would falter. So Gage began to plan, and in planning, he began to lose. The night the countryside woke up. In Boston, secrets did not keep well. Gage's plan was supposed to be unknown until the moment it unfolded. He ordered his officers to say nothing, to prepare their men without explanation, to avoid any behavior that might alert the city's vast and intricate Patriot intelligence network. He failed almost immediately. In a city where redcoats were quartered in public buildings and marched through public streets, any unusual activity was immediately noticed. And on the afternoon of April 18th, 1775, there was a great deal of unusual activity. British soldiers were being recalled from their usual stations. They were being gathered on the back bay, near the boats that would ferry them across the Charles River to begin their march. Paul Revere, riding through the city on errands, noticed. Joseph Warren, the Patriot physician who had become one of the most effective organizers in Boston, noticed. Dr. Warren sent for Revere and for William Dawes, another reliable courier, and gave them both the same task: ride to Lexington. Warn Adams and Hancock. Warn the countryside. Before he left, Revere arranged a signal with the sexton of Christ Church, Old North Church, on the north end of Boston, so that patriots across the water in Charlestown could see which route the British were taking. One lantern hung in the steeple if the soldiers were marching out through Boston Neck to the south. 2 lanterns if they were crossing the river by boat to Cambridge first and marching from there. 2 lanterns burned in the steeple of Old North Church that night. The British were going by water. Revere crossed the Charles River by rowboat, so quietly, the story goes, that a woman on the shore threw her petticoat to muffle the oarlocks, and reached Charlestown just after 11 o'clock. He borrowed a horse, a fast mare named Brown Beauty, belonging to Deacon John Larkin, and began riding north and west through the sleeping countryside. He did not ride in silence. That was not the point. At every house, at every tavern, at every farmstead where a light still burned, he knocked and shouted his warning. The regulars are out. The troops are coming. Pass it on." The system of alarm was already in place, and Revere's ride was more like the spark in a powder train than a solitary act of heroism. By the time he reached Lexington, just after midnight, the news had already begun to travel in all directions. Church bells rang in village after village, startling men out of sleep. Drums were beaten at militia headquarters. Riders fanned out from every junction along the road, carrying the alarm deeper into the countryside. Before the British column had gone 5 miles from Boston, the whole of eastern Massachusetts was awake and reaching for muskets. Revere reached the house where Adams and Hancock were staying in Lexington around midnight and delivered his warning. Both men were urged to leave, and eventually they did, though Hancock, with his characteristic combination of vanity and courage, initially resisted the idea of running. Revere stayed long enough to help secure some important papers, documents that the British must not find, and then, joined now by William Dawes and a young Concord physician named Samuel Prescott, who had been visiting his fiancée in Lexington, he pushed west toward Concord. They did not make it. A British patrol, advance scouts sent out the previous evening to clear the road of exactly such riders, intercepted them near Lincoln. Dawes escaped by wheeling his horse and galloping back toward Lexington in the dark. Revere was captured, questioned at gunpoint by officers who seemed already aware of where he had been and why, and eventually released without his horse when the patrol needed to move quickly toward the sound of an alarm gun. Samuel Prescott, who knew the back roads, jumped his horse over a stone wall into a field and rode on through the darkness to Concord, where he arrived around 2 in the morning. Concord was awake by the time Prescott arrived, but awake in the particular way of a town that has heard serious alarm before and has developed its own protocols. The militia company began gathering. Riders were sent to neighboring towns, Lincoln, Acton, Bedford, Carlisle, with the same urgent message. In the house of Colonel James Barrett, the commanding officer of the Concord militia, men were already loading wagons with the most sensitive military stores, hauling cannon carriages and barrels of provisions to farms across the river and into the woods beyond town. If the British came, they would find considerably less than they were looking for. Barrett was 65 years old, a farmer who had lived his entire life within a short ride of Concord. He was not a military man in any professional sense. He had served in the French and Indian War 20 years before, and what he had learned then was less about tactics than about what determined locally knowledgeable men could do against a larger force that did not know the ground. He had been preparing for this night for months, in his quiet, methodical way, attending provincial Congress meetings, organizing his militia, keeping an accurate count of the stores in his keeping. Now the moment was here, and he moved through it with a steadiness that would matter enormously in the hours to come. Back in Lexington, Captain John Parker was making decisions of his own kind. Parker was 45 years old and sick, genuinely sick, with tuberculosis, the illness that would kill him 5 months after this morning. He coughed through the night as his men gathered on the common, and when they had waited 2 hours in the cold without the British appearing, he made a practical decision. The men were cold and tired, and there was a tavern nearby. He dismissed his company and told them to stay close, to listen for the drum. Most of them went to Buckman Tavern, a 2-story wooden building at the edge of the green, where they drank cold cider and talked quietly and waited. They had been waiting, really, for years. They had waited through the Stamp Act crisis, and the Townsend duties, and the Boston Massacre, and the tea thrown into the harbor. They had waited through the Intolerable Acts, and the closing of the port, and the soldiers quartered in their city. Parker had served in the French and Indian War at the Siege of Louisburg in 1745, and he knew the difference between soldiers and militia, and what that difference meant in a stand-up fight. He did not believe his men could win a pitched battle against a regular British regiment. But he also believed something else, something harder to articulate, but no less real. That there were moments when standing your ground was itself the victory, regardless of what happened to you personally. Outside, the spring stars were fading. The drum would beat soon. The British column, meanwhile, had been having its own difficult night. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, commanding the expedition, was a cautious, methodical man in his mid-50s, the sort of officer who had risen steadily through competence rather than brilliance, and who was not much given to improvisation. He'd been given his orders by General Gage and had every intention of following them. His second in command was Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, a more energetic figure, professionally confident in the way of experienced regular officers, who have rarely encountered opposition they could not overcome. The men under their command were grenadiers and light infantry, the elite of the Boston garrison, larger than average men in the grenadiers' case, lighter and faster in the light infantry's. All of them trained soldiers who had earned their place through years of service. But the march itself was a trial. The boats that were supposed to be ready to ferry them across the Charles River were not ready on time, so they stood in the water of the back bay, wading in the dark, in water up to their knees. When they finally crossed and landed at Lechmere Point in Cambridge, it was nearly midnight, and they had to stand in the cold for another hour, waiting for provisions to be distributed. By the time they actually began marching toward Concord, it was nearly 2 a.m. They were already behind schedule, and already, in the distance, they could hear church bells ringing. Pitcairn had sent mounted officers ahead of the column to clear the roads of exactly the kind of riders who were already out there warning the countryside. But the countryside was too large and the riders too numerous, and the mounted officers caught only Revere and missed Prescott, and made no difference at all to the general alarm that was spreading in all directions around them. The soldiers marching through the dark knew, by the sound of those bells, that the element of surprise was gone. The only question now was whether the colonists would actually fight, or whether they would scatter at the sight of 700 trained soldiers and the glint of bayonets in the early light. Pitcairn thought they would scatter. Smith was not certain, and neither of them, on that long, cold march, could quite imagine what was actually waiting for them on Lexington Green. The shot heard round the world. Buckman Tavern's drummer boy beat the alarm just before dawn, and John Parker's men spilled out onto the common in the gray light, pulling their coats straight, gripping their muskets, arranging themselves in a rough two-rank line across the upper end of the triangular green. They numbered 77. Across the common and down the road, the foremost British soldiers were already visible, coming around the bend at a quick march, their red coats the color of fire in the thin morning light. Parker allegedly spoke to his men in words that have been repeated so often they have become the mythological property of the entire American identity. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Whether he said exactly those words, or some version of them, or something quite different, no one can know with certainty. What is certain is that he said something, and that his men heard it and did not run. Pitcairn rode to the front of the British column and ordered the regulars to deploy, to spread from their marching column into a battle line. It was a practiced maneuver, smooth and impressive, the sort of thing that worked on European battlefields to communicate immediate, overwhelming power. Then he shouted at the militiamen to disperse, to lay down their arms and go home. His voice carried authority, and it carried something else, a quality of genuine professional irritation at the idea that these farmers were going to make his morning difficult. Parker, looking at 700 men with bayonets, began to order his company off the green. They were not surrendering, not exactly. Dispersing was not the same as yielding. But the mathematics of the situation were undeniable. 77 could not fight 700. Not here. Not today. And then someone fired a gun. Who fired it remains one of the genuine mysteries of American history. The colonists said the British fired first, and specifically that Pitcairn fired his pistol to signal the attack. The British said a colonial fired first, either from a hiding place or the tavern window, or from among the dispersing militia. Some witnesses claimed it was a bystander, an elderly man watching from a fence. There were dozens of accounts filed in the days and weeks afterward, and they do not agree. Historians have argued about this for 2.5 centuries. The question may never be settled beyond reasonable doubt. But the gun fired. One shot. In the stillness of that cold April morning, with the smell of dew on the grass and the distant sound of church bells still echoing from the countryside, one gun fired a ball of lead into the future. Then the regulars fired. Whether by order or by panic or by reflex, the accounts disagree on this too. The front rank of British soldiers sent a volley into the militia. Then another volley. Men fell. 8 men died on Lexington Green in those first minutes. Jonas Parker, the captain's cousin, Robert Monroe, who had fought in the French wars, Caleb Harrington, Jonathan Harrington Jr., Samuel Hadley, John Brown, Asahel Porter, Isaac Muzzy. Jonathan Harrington was shot and crawled on his hands and knees to his own front door, where he died at his wife's feet as she ran out to him. 10 more were wounded. The survivors scattered into the surrounding fields and woods, some returning fire, most simply trying to get out of the way. Pitcairn managed to stop the firing before it became a massacre, but the damage was done. The British gave 3 cheers on the green, fired a volley in celebration, and continued their march west toward Concord. Behind them, the green was silent, except for the sound of women kneeling over the bodies of men who had been their husbands and fathers and neighbors an hour before. The war had begun. The column marched through the rest of the morning toward Concord, a steady, disciplined movement through countryside that was noticeably emptier than it should have been on a spring morning. Farms looked abandoned. Fences were still, without cattle moving behind them. The roads ahead were clear, but behind the stone walls and in the woodlots above the road, something was gathering, patient and invisible, waiting. In Concord, they had heard the guns at Lexington. The sound carried on the still morning air, and when the first riders came in with news of what had happened, that men had been killed, that the British column was marching toward them, the Concord militia and the companies beginning to arrive from neighboring towns moved out of town and up Punkatasset Hill, the high ground north of the village, to watch. Colonel Barrett assessed the situation from that hill with the cool calculation of a man who had been thinking about exactly this contingency for months. His men numbered perhaps 400 by mid-morning, with more arriving every hour from the surrounding towns. The British numbered 700, and they were regular soldiers, trained and armed and already demonstrably willing to shoot. Direct confrontation in the town itself was not a good idea. But abandoning the high ground and the bridge was not a good idea either. Barrett kept his men on the hill and watched. The British entered Concord and spread out through the town. Smith established his headquarters at Wright Tavern, where a legend later claimed Pitcairn stirred his brandy with his finger and declared he would stir Yankee blood the same way before the day was done. Companies were sent to search houses and barns for military stores. They found some: 500 pounds of musket balls, a collection of wooden gun carriages, some entrenching tools. The cannon had been moved to farms beyond the river. The flour barrels had been buried. Most of what Gage had sent them to destroy was simply gone. One company, under Captain Walter Laurie, was sent to hold the North Bridge, a wooden plank bridge over the Concord River, a quarter-mile north of the village center, while another searched the Barrett farm beyond it. Laurie had about 100 men and a bridge that was the only way back for the searching party. He took up a position at the Concord end of the bridge and waited. From Punkatasset Hill, the colonial militia watched the smoke rising from the center of town, where the British had set fire to some of the wooden gun carriages. Whether by accident or design, the fire spread to the Liberty Pole, and then to a building near the courthouse, and from the hill it looked, briefly, as though the British were burning Concord itself. Barrett made his decision. He ordered his men to march. The North Bridge. They came down the hill in a column, 400 men and growing, moving toward the North Bridge with muskets loaded and drums beating. The sound of the drums would have reached Captain Laurie's 100 men well before the militia came into sight, and what Laurie heard in those drums was a number problem he could not solve. He sent a rider to Smith requesting reinforcements, but Smith was occupied in the center of town, and his response was too slow. The colonial column came on. It was led, in the front rank, by Major John Buttrick of Concord and Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Davis of Acton, whose Acton company had arrived that morning armed, drilled, and carrying their own fifers and drummers. Davis was 30 years old, a gunsmith, a serious man who had spent years preparing his company for exactly this kind of moment. When the order was given to advance, he reportedly said, "I haven't a man that's afraid to go," and led from the front. At the bridge, Laurie attempted to delay the colonial advance by removing planks from the bridge, a defensive measure that would slow any crossing. But there was not time. The colonial column was moving at a quick march, and Laurie's men were clustered in too small a space at the Concord end of the bridge to deploy effectively. When the rear of Laurie's detachment fired a warning volley that sent musket balls skipping across the river's surface, and then the front ranks fired a ragged volley into the advancing militia, Isaac Davis fell, shot through the heart, killed instantly, the first officer to die in the American Revolution. And then, for the first time, the Minutemen fired back. Buttrick shouted the order, "Fire, fellow soldiers! For God's sake, fire!" And the colonial front ranks delivered a volley into the massed British at the end of the bridge. The effect was immediate and devastating. 3 British soldiers were killed and 9 wounded in a matter of seconds. A shocking casualty rate for a force that had barely been scratched at Lexington that morning. Laurie's men, seeing their companions fall, seeing more colonials coming behind the ones at the bridge, broke. They did not retreat in order. They ran, some of them throwing away their muskets, all of them moving as fast as their legs would carry them, back toward the center of Concord and the bulk of the British column. The colonial militia held the bridge. They stood there for a moment in a kind of stunned silence, looking at the British soldiers left behind, one badly wounded man trying to crawl away, and then at each other, and at the open road to Concord on the far side of the river. They had done it. They had engaged regular British soldiers and driven them from the field. The world would never look quite the same again. Smith managed to regroup his force in the center of Concord. His mission to destroy the military stores was largely a failure. He had found and destroyed only a fraction of what was there. He had 2 officers and 8 soldiers dead. He had an unknown number wounded. The countryside around him was clearly awake and clearly armed. He was 18 miles from Boston. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, and he had to get home. He formed his column and began to march east. The retreat, 16 miles of fire. What followed was a military nightmare that no European training had prepared any of these soldiers for. For the first half-mile, the road out of Concord was clear. The colonial militia had not yet moved to cut off the route, but as the British column approached the narrow part of the road near Merriam's Corner, where the road bent and squeezed between a stream crossing and rising ground on both sides, a volley of fire erupted from behind stone walls and from within a farmhouse, and did not stop. The colonists were not fighting in the European manner, in lines, in open ground, advancing and retreating according to the disciplines of formal warfare. They were fighting in the only way available to them, the way that the frontier and the terrain and common sense made obvious. Taking cover, firing from concealment, moving to the next protected position, firing again. Behind stone walls, behind trees, in the gullies and ravines and woodlots that bordered every mile of road between Concord and Boston, men who had grown up with muskets in their hands and who knew every rock and hollow of this country were waiting. The British tried to deploy flanking parties, soldiers who would leave the road and sweep through the terrain on either side, driving the snipers back from their positions. This worked sometimes. The flankers moved through the woods and cleared the walls and the farmyard fences, and the colonial fire would momentarily ease. But there was always another wall beyond the first one, always another cluster of men behind the next stand of trees, always another bend in the road ahead, where fresh militia from a town that had not yet been reached were taking up new positions. By the time the British column reached the Bloody Angle, a sharp bend in the road near Lincoln where the terrain forced the column to compress, and where colonial fire from three sides caught them simultaneously, the march had become a controlled disaster. Men were falling at a rate that no officer could rationalize as acceptable. The wounded were slowing the column's movement. Ammunition was running low. Soldiers who had marched most of the night were now fighting through the hottest part of the afternoon on legs that felt like lead. Smith himself was wounded, a ball through the leg that did not stop him from walking, but slowed him and reminded him with every step how bad the arithmetic of his situation was. He sent a rider galloping ahead to Boston, requesting reinforcements. If help did not come, the column might not make it. The men in the ranks were frightened, not in the way that soldiers sometimes pretend to be frightened when telling the story afterward, making themselves seem more heroic against the terror they overcame. They were genuinely, viscerally afraid, in the way that men are afraid when they are being shot at from positions they cannot see, by enemies who seem to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The road ahead curved into uncertainty. The woods beside the road held shadows, where any one of those shadows might contain a man with a loaded musket. When a soldier was hit and went down, there was a moment, brief but real, when the men around him wondered whether to stop and help or keep moving. And they usually kept moving, because stopping meant becoming a stationary target. At Lexington, they passed through the green where the morning's fight had happened. The bodies had been moved, but the blood was still visible in the grass, brown and dried now in the afternoon sun. The sight of it did not encourage the men in the column. They pressed east. It was at Lexington that the reinforcements arrived. Lord Percy had marched out from Boston with 1,200 additional soldiers and 2 artillery pieces, light field guns that fired grape shot and solid shot, and which, in the open terrain where they could deploy, were tremendously effective at clearing colonial positions. Percy was everything Smith was not: young, aristocratic, decisive, and deeply contemptuous of the colonial rabble. But he was also intelligent, and when he saw the condition of Smith's column, the wounded, the shattered discipline, the haunted faces of men who had been marching and fighting since 2 a.m, he understood immediately that this was not a situation that cool professionalism could easily rescue. Percy formed a defensive perimeter around the retreating column, covering the survivors of Smith's force while they rested for perhaps half an hour, long enough to drink from whatever water was available, and reload and breathe. The artillery cleared the most exposed positions, their cannon fire crashing through stone walls and sending colonial militiamen diving for cover. For a time, the road was relatively clear, but only for a time. As Percy's combined force resumed the march, the fire resumed with it. More men were arriving from more towns, from Watertown and Roxbury and Cambridge, men who had not yet fought and who came to the road fresh and eager and angry. Angry about what had happened at Lexington Green, and now also about the houses that British flankers had looted and the civilians who had been shot when they looked out of their windows to see what the noise was. By now, the colonial force along the road was not a militia company or even a regiment. It was a people. The British column passed through Monotamy, now Arlington, in what survivors described as the worst fighting of the entire day. The town was built along the road at close intervals, houses tight together, stone walls everywhere, a landscape that offered the colonists firing position after firing position with minimal exposure. The flanking parties were overwhelmed trying to clear the houses, and sometimes they resorted to breaking into buildings and killing every armed man inside, which in several cases included old men who had taken cover in their own kitchens. The colonial fire was equally ruthless, and by the time the column cleared Monotamy, losses on both sides had climbed to the point where the numbers were becoming difficult to believe. The sun was setting in the west, behind the column now, throwing long shadows ahead of the marching men. The road stretched east toward Charleston and the safety of the harbor. Every man in that column had been awake for at least 18 hours, and most of them much longer. Every man had been under fire for most of those hours. Every man had seen people killed beside him. And still the fire came from the walls and the trees, following the column like a shadow that would not be shaken. Percy made a critical decision as he approached Cambridge. Rather than taking the road through Cambridge, which would have put his column on ground where the colonists had been preparing ambush positions all afternoon, he turned the column north toward Charleston Neck, a narrow strip of land connecting Charleston to the mainland, which the British Navy controlled from the harbor. The colonists could not follow them onto the neck without exposing themselves to naval gunfire. It was the one direction in all of eastern Massachusetts from which the British could not be pursued. The last British soldiers crossed Charleston Neck as darkness fell on April 19, 1775. On the high ground of Bunker Hill, which the colonists would try to hold and nearly succeed in a battle less than 2 months away, Percy's rear guard fired a final volley into the colonial pursuit and watched the Minutemen stop at the edge of the neck, unwilling to cross onto ground the Navy controlled. Then it was over. The column shambled into Charleston. Men sat down in the street wherever they stopped, or simply fell where they stood. Officers tried to organize the wounded, tried to count the missing, tried to establish some order out of what had been a humiliating and exhausting and genuinely terrifying day. Some men wept. Some simply stared at nothing, the blank expression of soldiers who have seen more than they expected to see and are still trying to make sense of it. Across the neck, in the darkness of the Massachusetts countryside, the militiamen of 23 towns were gathering around fires, attending to their own wounded, counting their own dead, and trying to understand what had happened and what it meant. They had done something no one in the political world had quite expected. They had fought. The accounting. The morning of April 20th, 1775, was quiet. In Boston, General Gage wrote his dispatch to London. On the roads between Lexington and Charleston, farmers and their wives went out to find what the day had left behind. Some of what they found was hard to describe. The British losses were 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. Men who had fallen in places from which they could not be recovered, whose bodies were not found until days afterward, or who had been taken prisoner by colonial militiamen and were later exchanged. Among the dead were an officer of the Royal Marines, 3 sergeant majors, and men from 15 different regiments who had been pulled together from various units to make up the expeditionary force. The wounded included Smith himself, who had taken his ball through the leg and walked the last miles of the retreat on a leg that throbbed with every step. The colonial losses were 49 killed and 39 wounded. 49 men who had gotten out of bed in the gray pre-dawn, taken their muskets down from the wall, and walked to the green or the bridge or the road behind a stone wall, and not come home. Some of them were young, boys in their late teens who had been eager to prove something. Some were middle-aged, men with farms and families and no particular desire for glory, who had gone because their company needed them, and because not going was unthinkable. A few were old, men in their 50s and 60s who had fought the French and knew what they were getting into, and went anyway. Among the dead at Lexington was Jonas Parker, the captain's cousin, who had been wounded in the first volley and was bayoneted on the ground when the British infantry advanced. He had pledged, before the march that morning, never to run from the British, and he kept his word. Among the dead at the North Bridge was Isaac Davis of Acton, the gunsmith who had said his company wasn't afraid, shot through the heart at the moment the American Revolution acquired its first officer casualty. The battlefield at Concord, when the British column had departed and the smoke had cleared and the afternoon sun slanted across the green, was a strange and quiet place. The North Bridge stood above the Concord River, its planks undisturbed now that the fighting was done, and the river ran beneath it without interruption, cold and dark and indifferent. In the town center, the remains of burned gun carriages made black circles in the grass. A horse stood in a field without its rider, reins dragging, cropping at the spring grass as though nothing had happened. On the roads east of Concord, the evidence of the day's fighting was more difficult to look at. Spent musket balls lay in the mud and on stone walls and embedded in the siding of houses. In Menotomy, several houses showed evidence of the British flankers' passage: broken doors, overturned furniture, blood-stained floors. A woman later testified that soldiers had forced their way into her house and bayoneted a man inside. Another reported soldiers drinking her cider while her husband hid in the cellar. The road itself, for 16 miles, was marked with the darker patches where men had fallen and the blood had soaked into the earth and dried in the afternoon sun. By nightfall, the Continental Ring was tightening around Boston. Militia companies from across eastern Massachusetts had not simply dispersed after the column reached Charlestown. Many of them marched directly to positions surrounding the city, occupying Roxbury and Cambridge and the high ground above Charleston, and began what would become the Siege of Boston. Within days, the Provincial Congress had voted to raise an army of 13,600 men. Within weeks, men were coming from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire to reinforce the ring. Boston was sealed. Gage wrote to London that what had happened was not a riot, but a rebellion, and that it would require forces he did not have to suppress it. He was right, and London took months to understand what he meant. In those months, the war took its own shape, independent of anyone's plans. What the morning made. The news from Lexington and Concord traveled faster than anyone could have predicted. By the following morning, riders were already moving through southern New England with the story, and within a week it had reached as far south as Virginia and as far north as the Canadian border. The reports were not always accurate. Numbers were inflated, details were confused, atrocities were described that may not have occurred exactly as reported. But the essential fact was transmitted with perfect clarity. The British had fired on American civilians. Americans had fought back. Men were dead. The response was not uniform. There were colonists in Massachusetts and elsewhere who believed the whole affair was a catastrophic mistake, that accommodation with Britain was still possible and desirable, and that the path the radicals had chosen led only to ruin. There were loyalists who mourned the dead redcoats and condemned the ambush as cowardly and illegal. There were merchants who worried about what this would do to trade, and professionals who wondered what a war would cost, and farmers who wanted nothing more than to be left alone to tend their fields. But the emotional weight of the story was overwhelmingly on one side. The British had marched into American communities in the dark and shot men in the face on a village green. The Americans had been defending their homes and their rights and their stores of powder against soldiers who had no business being there. The moral clarity of the narrative, however complicated the reality might have been, was irresistible, and it swept through the colonies with the force of something that had been building for a decade and had finally found its form. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, with the Battle of Lexington and Concord as its immediate context and its unavoidable background noise. The delegates who gathered there had not come to declare independence. That would take another year of war and anguish and political maneuvering. But they had come knowing that what had happened in Massachusetts could not simply be undone. They appointed George Washington to command the Continental Army, a decision that would prove, over 8 years and innumerable disasters and recoveries, to be perhaps the most consequential personnel choice in American history. But the significance of April 19, 1775, went deeper than any particular consequence that followed from it. What the men at Lexington and Concord had demonstrated was something that could not be undemonstrated once the demonstration had been made. That an armed citizenry, fighting on familiar ground for their own homes and rights, could impose serious costs on a professional army. They had not defeated the British. They had not won a battle in any conventional military sense. The British had achieved most of their immediate objectives. They had gotten to Concord, they had destroyed some stores, they had returned to Boston. But they had done so at a price that no one in London had anticipated, and they had left behind them a countryside that was no longer deferential or uncertain or intimidated. The mythology of the Minuteman grew from those 16 miles of road between Concord and Charlestown in ways that would shape American political culture for centuries. The image of the ordinary citizen, a farmer who set down his plow and took up his musket, who asked no pay and sought no glory, but who would stand in the path of tyranny and fight before he would submit. That image became one of the foundational elements of American identity, invoked in every generation as justification and inspiration and warning. It has been romanticized and simplified, but at its core, it contained something real. The memory of men who were afraid and stood anyway, who were outgunned and fired back, who were killed and were replaced by others who came from the next town and kept fighting. The British Empire that marched away from Concord on the afternoon of April 19, 1775, was not yet defeated. It would take 8 more years of war, Valley Forge, Saratoga, the intervention of France, and the grinding toll of a conflict fought across 3,000 miles of ocean, before American independence was officially recognized. Many of the men who stood on Lexington Green that morning did not live to see it. Some died at Bunker Hill 2 months later, or at Long Island and Princeton, or of disease and cold and the slow attrition of a long war fought by men who were never adequately fed or clothed or paid. But the shot fired on Lexington Green, whichever side fired it, for whatever reason, had started something that could not be unstarted. It was, as Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote 62 years later, at the same bridge where Isaac Davis had fallen, the shot heard round the world. The phrase is a poet's exaggeration, but it contains a truth. What happened at Lexington and Concord was immediately understood across the Atlantic world as something new. A colonial people had refused to submit to an empire. They had organized their own resistance. They had died for their own sense of what they were owed. And when the empire sent its soldiers, they had stood in the road and fought. The revolution that followed would be the first successful colonial revolution in the modern era. It would inspire the French Revolution, which would transform Europe. It would inspire the Haitian Revolution, which would abolish slavery on an island and terrify slaveholders across the Americas. It would eventually inspire independence movements across Latin America, across Africa, across Asia, in places and at times that the men at the North Bridge in April 1775 could not have imagined. The vocabulary they helped create, self-determination, natural rights, government by consent of the governed, would become the vocabulary of political modernity, for good and for ill, and for all the complications in between. Today, if you drive out from Boston along Route 2A through Lexington and Concord, you will pass through towns that look comfortable and prosperous in the way of successful New England suburbs. The streets are lined with trees and colonial-era houses and coffee shops and real estate offices. In Lexington, the triangular green is still there, a small and somewhat incongruous strip of grass in the middle of busy suburban traffic. A statue of Captain John Parker stands at the corner nearest the road, and visitors stop to photograph it and read the stone marker, and then move on. In Concord, the North Bridge is a reconstruction, wooden planks over the Concord River, a simple arch that you can walk across in 30 seconds. On the far bank, a bronze Minuteman stands on a granite pedestal, his plow abandoned behind him, his musket in his hand, looking east toward where the British came from. Behind him, across the fields, the town of Concord goes on with its business. But in April, when the maples have just leafed and the fields have that first green of spring, and the air smells of wet earth and the last cold of winter, you can stand on that bridge and listen to the river below and feel something of what the morning felt like. The silence before the shot, the weight of a decision that could not be unmade, the understanding that standing still in the face of what was coming was itself a kind of courage that words like courage can barely contain. 77 men stood on the green in the morning, and the world that came after was built from what they did next.